Timothy Niblock, who was an emeritus professor, chair of management board of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, and is now special advisor to Vice Chancellor of the Middle East of the University of Exeter. He has a PPE from Oxford, a DPhil in International Relations from the University of Sussex. He has worked as professor of Arab, Gulf and Middle Eastern Studies in the University of Durban. He has taught at the University of Reading and in Khartoum, and has published considerable volume of literature, including on Chinese involvement in West Asia, and this will be an important aspect of the coming discussions. I have with me two of my senior colleagues from the Foreign Service. On my right is Ambassador Ranjit Gupta, who is a Foreign Service officer who joined our ministry in 1964. He has served in Cairo, New York, Bangkok, Jeddah, Frankfurt, Sanaa, Kathmandu, and was later India's ambassador to Yemen, Venezuela, Oman, Thailand and Spain, and the head of India's representation in Taiwan. He is presently Fellow of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies in New Delhi and is a visiting Fellow in IDSA. He has been a visiting professor in Jamia Millia and ambassador in residence in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has also worked as the head of West Asia and North Africa Division in the Ministry of External Affairs. To my left, we have Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, who has had a long and distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service. After joining in 1974, he has served in Indian missions in Baghdad, Jeddah, London and Pretoria. He also served as India's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman and UAE. He is presently working in an energy company in Dubai. He has published two seminal volumes on the reform in the Arab world, external influences and regional debates, and Children of Abraham at War, the clash of messianic militarisms. Talmiz worked as head of the Gulf Division in the Ministry of External Affairs and as additional secretary in the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas. Without further ado, I'll request Professor Timothy Niblock to let us have a benefit of his views.
Thank you very much, Chairman. This is the second time that I'm standing here during this conference. And on the earlier occasion, actually, I was also on together with Ambassador Talmiz. And in many ways, I think the three of us on the panel today form something of a triple act on this subject, together indeed with a wider group of us who are all interested in this kind of topic which we're dealing with today and which we've been meeting on for some time. And what I want to talk about really is not so much about the role of Asia in the evolving security dynamics of the region, as about what space there may be for Asian powers to play a role. And the space which is available depends on how much space the United States may choose or be forced by circumstances to vacate. So the main focus is, in fact, on the possibility that some or all of the space occupied by the US in the region may be vacated, and in which case, how and where do Asian countries come in, other Asian countries come in. Now, at this stage, I should say that I'm not a specialist in US foreign policy, but I'm taking it that this kind of round table, as it's described, this kind of discussion, allows one to speculate outside of one's own realm of specialization, and perhaps by doing that to provoke reactions from people which take the whole discussion forward. The perspective from which the analysis needs to start is, of course, the transformation which is taking place at the moment in the Gulf's economic orientation. And by economic orientation, I should stress that I'm not only talking about oil. It's something much wider than that, this economic orientation. although of course oil is central to it. I don't want to spend very long on this as I've written and talked about it elsewhere, but briefly there are three elements to this. The first, which is a point which is often forgotten in the Western world, is that the Gulf itself is not only part of Asia geographically, but is also part of what one can call rising Asia. The Gulf constitutes part of the global shift in economic power itself. Its sovereign wealth funds and its major corporations have gained a very central role in international investments. Its rates of growth through the Western financial crisis have been more similar to those of other Asian countries than to those of Western countries. So it is quite important, I think, to set the Gulf economically within that framework. Secondly, there has, of course, been the remarkable shift of Gulf trade from the West to the East in recent years. And I think it's important to stress how quick that change has been taking place. Because in the year 2005, China and India were not major trading partners of the Gulf states. And by the major trading partners, I'm counting the top four. And by Gulf states, by the way, I'm including the 6 GCC states plus Iraq and Iran, all of them, all 8 together. In 2005, as I said, China and India were not among the top 4. In 2009, this had changed very radically, and China and India had become suddenly the 3rd and the 4th biggest trading partners of the Gulf as a whole. And that trend has continued since then and has been strengthened. Every year on the 1st of May, the International Monetary Fund comes out with its figures, statistics on trade during the previous year. And every year after the 1st of May, I do calculations to work out where trade is moving and how it's changing. So on the 1st of May this year, I'll be doing calculations on 2012. And I feel at this stage fairly sure that I know how it's going to work out, looking at the trends which are taking place. And I think we'll find out that in 2012, the largest trading partner for the Gulf states, all taken together, is going to be China, for the first time displacing the European Union from the top. The European Union will be down to second. The third, I think, will be India. The fourth will be Japan. And then quite a long way down, then you get South Korea, and even further down, the United States. So this is a substantial change which has taken place over a short period of time. Moreover, it's a change, I think, which will be intensified and the pace will be increased over the years ahead. And that is tied in, of course, to the developments in the world energy market, looking through to the year 2030. And over that period, according to projections, demand for oil in the West, Europe and North America goes down through energy efficiency, through conservation, and through slow growth. The supply of energy from sources outside of conventional oil, like has come from the Gulf, increases, much of it from sources sorry, can I just make sure that I'm saying the right thing here? Yes, the supply of conventional oil increases, but much of it is from sources in North America and elsewhere. And in fact, the fastest element of growth in energy is not in oil at all. It's in renewables, like wind and solar and whatever, in hydropower, in nuclear power, in natural gas, and quite a lot of that coming from shale gas, mainly in North America, and also in unconventional oil shale oil, in particular, coming through hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's often known. I want now to look at the implications of this for the countries concerned, just briefly. And I should say that some of the projections which have been around about this are, I think, wrong. Some of the projections which have come from the International Energy Agency, I think, have been very misleading. And there has been the impression, for example, that the United States is going to be exporting oil by 2020. Well, it's not. The United States in 2030 will still actually need to be importing some oil. If you ask me where these figures are coming from, I'm taking these figures from the oil industry itself and its projections. And in particular, there's, I think, in fact, the best of the projections about energy and oil is the BP Outlook for World Energy. And that came out in the middle of January, and those are the most recent figures. And it incorporates things which have come from the International Energy Agency and other agencies, but it is coming very much from within the oil industry and is, I think, very well informed. And it's quite important to note that shale oil, which can also be referred to as tight oil or unconventional oil, is not the same as oil shale. And there have been these projections around that the United States has huge amounts of oil shale and there's going to be more oil than Saudi Arabia. Well, that's not true, because the element which is important is shale oil and not oil shale. And shale oil is where rock is fractured and there are pools of oil within it which can be drawn out. Oil shale can be, again, when rock is fractured, but when you take out then a kind of putty which has got oil in it. But to create oil from that, you have to raise the temperature of that to 500 degrees centigrade. And it takes up so much energy, it wastes most of the energy which one would hope to get out of it. So there's very little energy which can come from that kind of oil in the future. But unconventional oil in the form of tight oil or shale oil is important, but not as important as some people tend to think. But the United States is the place where this is going to take off. And it will add significantly to the United States supply of oil from its own territories, but it will not cover the United States oil needs. So over the future, the United States will need to import oil. This is through to 2030, but certainly not nearly as much as it does today. Moreover, quite a lot of the US demand could be met from the Western Hemisphere as a whole, some of it coming from the oil sands in Canada, and also some from Brazil and whatever. So it will have relatively little need for Gulf oil. Maybe it would have some need, but not very significant. Europe will still need quite a lot of Gulf oil, but less than now. Overall world demand for oil will actually increase a bit, and that is largely because the greatly increased demand for oil, conventional oil, coming by Asian countries. And when one refers to Asian countries, it is actually largely China and India. And the estimates for 2030 is that China will need an extra 7 million barrels of oil a day, and India 4 million barrels of oil a day. So if you think of that and consider how oil is going to move, that gives you an idea of the increased pace at which the reorientation of Gulf trade will take place. Moreover, the countries concerned, India and China, cannot be expected just to be buying more Gulf oil. They will want a full economic relationship with their own exports to the Gulf region increasing as well. And it should be said that their exports to the region are increasing anyway. It's not just a matter of oil. Now, I don't want to come to conclusions about the likelihood of a change in US policy in the Gulf myself coming from this, with a lessening or withdrawal of its strategic power in the region. But I do want to outline what I see as the main considerations which need to be taken into account. And I'm going to do this by dealing first with the case for expecting a US withdrawal or a partial or a full withdrawal from the Gulf, and then go on to outline the case for not expecting a US withdrawal. And then, hopefully, in the discussion, these will provide a framework for taking consideration of this further. So, dealing first with the case for expecting a US withdrawal from the Gulf, or partial or full, the arguments advanced on this side are, firstly, following from what I've said, the US now has no significant economic interest of its own in retaining a presence in the region. Secondly, the Gulf engagement in the past has been rather problematic for the United States, Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever, and a release from that entanglement might be deemed beneficial to some in the United States. Thirdly, the fiscal problems in the United States require a substantial scaling back of government expenditure, such as that on defense. Fourthly, US economic and strategic interests now need to be focused on the Pacific region, with less reason for a presence in the Middle East. Fifthly, the US belief that European countries should take more responsibility for their own security, and the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions are more crucial and will be more crucial to Europe than to the United States. Sixthly, the idea that the United States has an interest in breaking free of entanglements with non-democratic regimes, which is put forward by some quarters in US opinion. And seventhly, that with the US withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan, there is now no need for securing support within the wider region. And the evidence which is put forward to support that kind of line is, I'll put it in 3 points. Firstly, the fact that President Obama has shown himself to be a Pacific president, so as one might say, frequently giving emphasis to the US role as a Pacific power. In his speech to the Australian Parliament on the 17th of November 2011, he said, "After a decade in which we fought 2 wars that cost us dearly in blood and treasure, the United States is turning our attention to the vast potential of the Asia-Pacific region. In just a few weeks, after nearly 9 years, the last American troops will leave Iraq and our war there will be over. In Afghanistan, we've begun a transition. Our new focus on this region reflects a fundamental truth. The United States has been and always will be a Pacific nation." And one had similar kinds of views being put forward by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in the article which she wrote, America's Pacific Century, which came shortly after that. And then one had the concept of an Asia pivot in US defense policy, which was really linked into these kind of ideas, which was articulated in a number of statements and pronouncements from the Department of Defense, especially the one in January 2012, stating that the United States will of necessity rebalance towards the Asia-Pacific region. So those are the sort of arguments for expecting a US withdrawal. But I'd like now to go quickly through the arguments against, the arguments for not expecting it. And those which are put forward are, firstly, that the United States' interests are global and strategic, that they are not limited to short-term economic interests. the Gulf region will have a continued significance in the global balance of power, or balances of power. And although the United States may not itself be dependent on Gulf oil, many other countries and allies of the United States are and will continue to be. The second point is that the US remains committed to countering international terrorism, and that many people think requires some kind of a presence within West Asia. Thirdly, that the US has ongoing treaty obligations and understandings with Gulf governments, and it would look bad to break those. Fourthly, a key objective of US global policy at present is to restrict the spread of nuclear weapons, with the issue of Iran, and that might be another aspect where it needs to remain engaged. Fifthly, the US has over the years shown an unwavering commitment to support the State of Israel, and that might also require a regional presence. And sixthly, that the Asia pivot has greater significance for Europe's strategic position than it does for the Gulf. In other words, European countries should rely on their own defense resources, not on the US, and it doesn't necessarily involve the Gulf region. And the evidence which is put forward to support that is, firstly, that there's no mention made in the documents which I've referred to above of any lessening of US commitment to Gulf security, so-called. Indeed, in one of the documents on the Asia pivot, that is defined as stretching into the Indian Ocean as well as further east. Secondly, that senior US government personnel have specifically rebutted the idea that there's any lessening of the US commitment. And one can also see that the number of US ships and aircraft deployed in the Gulf in 2012 actually increased rather than decreased. And that, of course, was linked in to the question of Iran. And now, to try to conclude from that, I mean, I've tried in that to create a framework for people to consider where there might be space for the role of Asian powers, India, China, and whatever, and to make it possible to to see what kind of role they can play. But I think in the framework of this needs to bear in mind, and indeed it should be at the forefront, what is best for the Gulf region itself. And it seems to me that Gulf states now, theoretically at least, are in a stronger position than before to lessen external strategic involvement in the region, whether from the west or the east. The Western powers have less economic incentive than before to seek or agree to deploy their naval and armed forces in the region. And the leading Asian military powers, China and India, I think, have no reason to do so. Oil will not be particularly scarce over the next 2 decades, and all sides, I think, have an interest in a stable and peaceful Gulf where every country has equal access. Competitive rivalry expressed in military terms would be damaging to all. I think the problem, though, which one has in this is the kinds of division and rivalry and competition within the Gulf itself. It is, of course, often that kind of rivalry which has brought in external powers into the security framework of the region. And I think it is in the interest of the Gulf states and also of Asian countries to see what bridges can be created to bring about reconciliation, to reach agreements, especially between Iran and Saudi Arabia, so that this compulsion to bring in external powers is diminished, if not eliminated. I'm sorry I've been speaking so quickly. I've been trying to get through as much as possible, and as a result of that, a bit of this might have come across in a slightly garbled fashion. Thank you.